The air outside had grown unnaturally cold. Mrs. Claus felt the sting of it on her skin, even though she was still inside the warmth of Santa's workshop. The fire that had once comforted her now seemed like a faint memory, a distant warmth that belonged to another life. She moved mechanically, her feet following Bernard as though some unseen force had taken control of her body. The elves that had gathered around her were all eerily silent, their eyes fixed forward, their expressions frozen in a way that felt wrong. It was as if the life had been drained from them, replaced with something dark and soulless. The path ahead was unclear. Where were they going? Mrs. Claus could barely focus on the ground beneath her feet, her mind reeling from the strange events that had unfolded in such a short time. The sound of the siren had left a ringing in her ears, and the oppressive silence that followed made the air feel thick, suffocating. Each breath she took felt more difficult than the last, and yet she was compelled to keep moving. Bernard's footsteps echoed through the halls, the sharp clack of his boots the only sound in the otherwise still workshop. As they walked, Mrs. Claus could hear the whispers of the other elves, their voices low and indistinct, but still carrying a sense of malice. It was as though they were speaking in a language she couldn't understand, a language that twisted the very air around her. The deeper they went into the building, the darker it became. The lights flickered, casting strange shadows along the walls, and the temperature dropped even further. Mrs. Claus shivered, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders, but it did little to stave off the growing sense of dread that crept over her. She could feel eyes on her from every direction. The other elves watched her, their gazes cold and unfeeling. They moved with a strange fluidity, as though they were following a script, each one knowing exactly where to stand, where to look, and when to move. Something was wrong. It wasn't just the silence, or the strange way the elves behaved, it was the feeling that she was being drawn towards something terrible, something that she couldn't comprehend. At last, they arrived at a large door, one that Mrs. Claus had never seen before. It stood at the end of a long, narrow hallway, its wooden surface dark and worn with age. The door seemed to loom over them, casting an ominous shadow across the floor. Bernard stopped in front of it, turning to face her with those lifeless eyes. His lips parted, but this time, his voice was softer, almost whispering. "It's time," he said. Mrs. Claus felt a cold shiver run down her spine. What was happening? Where was Jeremiah? Where was the warmth and the joy of Christmas? The holiday spirit that had once filled the air had long since faded, replaced by something dark, something ancient that she couldn't understand. Without another word, Bernard turned the handle, and the door creaked open. The room beyond was vast, its ceiling lost in shadow, the air thick with the scent of something burning, something ancient and foul. Mrs. Claus stepped forward, her mind racing, her heart pounding in her chest. The room was filled with a strange, flickering light that seemed to come from nowhere, casting long, twisted shadows along the walls. At the center of the room stood a large stone altar, its surface cracked and worn with age. The stone was stained, as though it had been touched by blood, though the color was too dark to be certain. The altar seemed to pulse with a dark energy, as if it were alive, waiting for something or someone. The air was thick with the weight of history, as if this place had been waiting for a moment like this for centuries. The silence was almost deafening, broken only by the sound of Bernard's footsteps as he moved to stand by the altar. His face remained impassive, his eyes cold and empty. Mrs. Claus took a hesitant step forward, but before she could speak, a new sound filled the room, a low, guttural hum, like the sound of something ancient awakening. It was a sound that seemed to vibrate in the very bones of the earth, a sound that chilled her to the core. The walls around her seemed to close in, the shadows stretching longer, darker. And then, slowly, figures began to emerge from the darkness. They were tall, cloaked in tattered robes that seemed to move of their own accord, as if they were alive. Their faces were hidden in the hoods, but their presence was unmistakable. Mrs. Claus felt an overwhelming sense of terror, an instinctive urge to run, to escape. But her body refused to obey. The figures approached the altar, their movements deliberate, their eyes never leaving Mrs. Claus. She wanted to scream, to run, but she couldn't. It was as if some invisible force had wrapped around her, holding her in place. One of the figures stepped forward, its voice a low rasp that seemed to echo through the room. "The time has come." Mrs. Claus didn't understand what they meant. What time? What was happening? Her mind was a whirl of confusion and fear. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the words wouldn't come. The figure raised a hand, and with a single motion, the room seemed to shift. The ground trembled, and the altar before her cracked open, revealing a dark, gaping hole. From the depths of the hole came a dark, pulsating energy, as though it were alive, feeding off the fear in the room. Mrs. Claus felt herself being pulled toward it, her body moving against her will, her limbs heavy and unresponsive. The darkness beckoned, promising release from the terror, but at the same time, threatening to consume her whole. And then, as she reached the edge of the altar, the figure spoke again, its voice a chilling whisper. "Your time has come, Irma Holt. Your sacrifice will ensure the next Santa's reign." The words echoed in Mrs. Claus's mind, and a cold realization swept over her. This wasn't just about her, it was about the very essence of Christmas, of the holiday that she had once cherished. She was being drawn into something far older, far darker than she could comprehend. As the darkness closed in, she could only watch helplessly, unable to move, unable to escape. The last thing she saw before the world around her went black was Bernard's face, his eyes cold and lifeless, his lips twisted into something that almost resembled a smile.